Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and one of the ongoing paradoxes of contemporary American Jewish life is that, on the one hand, a large majority of American Jews say they are proud to be Jewish. And at the very same time, a large majority of American Jews say they have little to no interest in the state of Israel. It is the least of their concerns. There's a serious disconnect among a majority of American Jews when it comes to the state of Israel. Why? Is it Israel's fault? Is there something Israel has done to create this divide? Is there something Israel could do to shrink the divide? Or does this issue really have very little to do with Israel at all, or with Israeli policy? Is there something bigger, more serious, behind this disconnect many American Jews feel regarding the state of Israel? Well, one American Jewish scholar has been spending a great deal of time studying and writing about this phenomenon of Jewish disconnect from the state of Israel. His name is Kenneth Levin, a psychiatrist who for more than 40 years taught at Harvard Law School. Ken also has a PhD in history from Princeton University. And Ken Levin is the author of the most important work on American Jewish attitudes towards Israel, entitled The Oslo Syndrome, Delusions of a People Under Siege, which draws an analogy between the well-documented Stockholm Syndrome, where victims internalize the ideology of their abusers, and the Jewish tendency to identify with the haters of Israel. Most recently, as we sit together on this edition of L'Chaim, Ken Levin is also the author of a major piece published by the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar-Ilan University, entitled American Jews and Their Israel Problem. And Ken, it is wonderful to have you sitting with me at this table. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
You have done some of the most important work and study on this entire issue. And so it's an honor to have you sitting here.
Thank you. It's my honor to be here.
We'll talk about your work in one moment. Just place us for you, place our audience, for our viewers, who the heck you are. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
I was born in Philadelphia, grew up in South Philadelphia.
You're a Philadelphia boy.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And you went to high school there?
I went to high school in Philly.
What kind of Jewish home did you grow up in?
Not a very Jewish.
Yes, it was very
committed
Jewish.
Jewish, not very observant. My grandmother, maternal grandmother, lived with us, was Orthodox. We kept a kosher home, so that's certainly what they weren't regular attendees to shul.
Any kind of Shabbat in your home growing up?
Shabbat, yes.
Friday night?
Yes.
Lit candles?
Yes, absolutely. My Jewish identity was strong from the beginning, and my identity with Israel was strong from the beginning. And I remember at age 12, the '56 war, and talking with those few friends, older, who were interested in it, what was going on and why, and wanted to follow what was happening. So
even at 12?
Even at 12.
That's amazing. So you're 12 in 1956, and now it's 1967. Where are you in 67?
In '67, I was studying at Oxford. It was my second year at Oxford. I was completing a degree program. And
in?
English language and lit.
And the Six-Day War occurs?
Yes.
Okay. I was in rabbinical school. You were at Oxford. When I saw what was happening, I did not know Israel was going to win a war in 6 days. I was very worried existentially for the state of Israel. Did you share some of that?
Absolutely.
Then we were wrong.
We were wrong.
6 days later, the world changes. Ken.
Well, I was ecstatic with what happened. And if it had an impact on me too, as much as I was fascinated with Israel, focused on Israel to a considerable degree before the war, I followed events even more intensely after in the wake of the war.
Okay, you continue your career, you become a psychiatrist, and then along the way you get married?
Yes,
Okay. And you have a wife who's also done quite amazing things for the Jewish world, yes?
absolutely.
Her name is?
Andrea Levin.
And hello, and you got married when?
We got married in 1971.
97. When you married her, did she already have this commitment to Israel as you did?
Yes.
She's the head of CAMRA.
Yes.
Explain to our audience what CAMRA is.
CAMRA is a media monitoring response organization, and CAMRA itself had been founded in '82 in response to the horrible coverage, much of it, of the Israeli incursion into Lebanon that year.
It's an extraordinary organization.
Yes.
That monitors the way Israel is treated in the media.
Yes.
Just, it's extraordinary. And we call it to both of you.
Thank you.
So at some point, you write what has now become a classic, the Oslo Syndrome.
Thank you.
Okay? And you heard me describe it in the open as drawing a parallel with the Stockholm Syndrome,
Yes.
which I described as ultimately somebody who's being abused in many ways, not simply kidnapped, becomes to identify with the ideology of the abuser, the kidnapper, whoever is oppressing them. Are you comfortable with my description?
Excellent description.
Okay. How did you come to write this book?
Well, I was very upset with the Oslo agreements, the initial Oslo agreements. I thought it was going to lead to disaster, and had been writing. I had published several articles, several in the Jerusalem Post, and one in the New Republic in the months prior to the Oslo agreement, saying that the conditions were not right for peace, that nobody on the other side was interested in peace with Israel at this time.
You know, the Jewish world was somewhat euphoric at
Right.
that time. Even in Israel.
That's right. It was
euphoria.
It was fairly evenly split in Israel, but those who were pro-Oslo were indeed euphoric, and people making statements of this is the end of war forever, we won't have to worry about our youngsters being killed in battle, which obviously one can sympathize with that desire, but is this really the way to lead to that? And we were very good friends at the time with David Bar-Ilan, who was the editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post. And just prior to Oslo, there was about 2 weeks between when the Oslo agreements the initial agreements were announced and when there was the ceremony on the White House lawn in September of 1993. And he published on the front page of the Post an op-ed by his publisher, who was very pro-Oslo, and by me saying this is going to lead to disaster, and it was very nice of him because he was going against the publisher, obviously, to do something like that. And so I was writing occasionally in the subsequent months about what was going on. And then in about 3 years, I think it was probably '96, after the start of Oslo, I wrote an article entitled in English, Jews, Israelis, and the Psyche of the Abused. And there was a Israeli quarterly called Nativ, and the editor translated into Hebrew and published it in Hebrew in the quarterly. And some people who read it in Hebrew wanted it published in English. They helped get it out in English, but also...
What was the bottom line?
The bottom line is that Oslo itself was a reflection of this phenomenon of so desperately wanting peace, or so desperately wanting to end the assault, whether you're talking about the assault of, say, on a minority by the surrounding majority, or the assault on a small state by larger surrounding states, So they said within those populations, there are always some who so desperately want end the assault that they embrace the attacks of the besiegers, however outrageous, however unfair, in the hope that by accommodating those attacks, they could win relief. And so there were Israelis who would grasp onto anything that was said by the other side or by members affiliated with the other side that would suggest that, oh, if only you do if you do this or if you do that. Any conciliatory statements the other side would make in English to appease the Western world, they would grab onto that and say, okay, let's make the accommodations. All we have to do is give up land. All we have to do is, some were even saying, make the state less Jewish, give up Hatikva, give up the flag, and then we'll have peace. And I was saying this was the delusion, and it was going to, and it was something that echoes throughout the history of the diaspora as well as the history of Israel. And
okay, we're going to talk about that in 1 minute. It's important that our audience have a sense of where you are on the what we call the political spectrum. First of all, when it comes to America, do you tend to lean liberal or conservative?
I was pretty much a centrist at the time when I was growing up. My heroes were people like Scoop Jackson.
Yeah. A certain kind of Democrat.
A certain time, again, Hubert Humphrey, Kennedy. These were people.
Okay, so we all grow up. We grew up as traditional liberal Jewish kids, idealistic, and we wanted the best for America, and we supported the civil rights movement. Yes.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, in terms of the Israeli perspective, before Oslo, Ken, if you and I, if the four of us were lucky enough to go out to dinner, we were talking about how we looked at the state of Israel and the political scene, would somebody who was listening to this conversation say, oh, Ken definitely leans right? Or would they describe you in a different way? How would you self-identify yourself in terms of the Israeli political spectrum?
Well, let me go, if I can, go back a few years earlier. And prior to the 77 election.
That's Begin.
That's a Begin election. And if one looks at what were traditional labor positions prior to the 77 election, they were very reasonable positions. The positions that Israel does not want to be in control of an alien population, that Israel would have to retain elements of the Judea and Samaria for its defense.
But for defensive purposes.
For defensive purposes primarily.
Golan Heights?
At Golan Heights, certainly.
Absolutely, right.
And that, and labor's then approach was to think in terms of returning those areas that with our heavily populated. And at the time there was, one could say fortunately, definitely fortunately, that most heavily populated areas were typically not the most strategically sensitive areas. For the most part, there are exceptions. So that what was called the Alon Plan, or after Yigal Allon, from shortly after the Six-Day War, that was the idea of returning certain areas that could be returned with the vast majority of the population to Jordanian control and retaining those areas that Israel required for its defense. And interestingly enough, there's a split around Oslo, and people forget this, that in Rabin's last speech to Knesset prior to his assassination, he was still talking about Israel needing to retain those areas.
Absolutely.
Including what he said was the Jordan Valley in the widest sense, which meant the heights overlooking the valley as well. So I thought this was a perfectly reasonable position.
Okay, so prior to 77, you were a mainstream advocate within the Israeli system of labor.
Yeah, I wasn't.
It's not, by the way, it's not a political affiliation. I'm
Yes,
just saying
yes,
ideologically that's
yes,
where we were.
Yes.
Okay, and by the way, I'm skipping ahead. We'll come back to 77. If somebody said to you, Are you philosophically in favor of a two-state solution? What would you have said in 1989?
In '89, I still preferred I still held out hope, as did many people, for example, in labor, and many people in the Likud too, it should be said, that Jordan could be re-engaged. Because I thought that the idea of having a disarmed state in Judea and Samaria was unrealistic. There are no disarmed states. That it's much more likely to have a disarmed area of a larger state. So the idea of reverting to Jordanian control and being disarmed was more realistic than they were going to create a state. I mean, for example, Israel had the agreement. They made concessions to the Egyptians because of the Egyptian struggle in the Sinai with terror organizations. But we had essentially largely disarmed Sinai Peninsula since the agreement with Egypt. The same could have been done then. I thought the idea of creating an actual state and having it become permanently was unrealistic.
Okay, but the discussion, even at the end of the 80s, has been in some way since the 70s on. The discussion has always been framed about, can there be a two-state solution?
Right.
And of course, the American foreign policy has been predicated on a notion one day there would be a two-state solution, and there are people who are still upset about what Trump has done recently with Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, blah, 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 because the argument is it impedes the possibility of a two-state solution. But now forget 1989. In 1990, there was the euphoria because there was the possibility, the belief was there was a possibility now that if the PLO under Yasser Arafat could revamp itself, would literally change its charter, not only in words, but in ideology, that, okay, Jew and Arab, Jew and Palestinian would share a piece of land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which, Ken, was what Ben-Gurion and the Yishuv had accepted in the middle 30s, when the Peel Commission said, this is the only way to make peace, do you want it or not? The Jews said yes, the Arabs said no. And that, in my view, has been the policy of Jew and Arab since 1936, 37, 38, right till today. The Jew has said repeatedly, we will share this land, although we believe it's ours. Although we believe it's ours, although the UN ratified a League of Nations mandate that said all of the land on both sides of the Jordan was going to be a Jewish homeland, we will now, after losing Jordan, we'll still divide the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan Sea, and we will share that land. That's been the Jewish stance since the 1930s till today. And then in the 1990s, it seemed like, wait, maybe there was a Palestinian leader who understood there had to be a total revamping of Palestinian ideology and politics, and Yasser Arafat was going to lead us with Yitzhak Rabin and Bill Clinton into the promised land. There would be a two-state solution with a state that was going to live in peace side by side with the state of Israel. If tomorrow I were promised, with a messianic promise, that there would be a Palestinian people living like Canada lives with America on that land, I would be in favor of a two-state solution. I've been so as long as I can remember. My problem, Ken, is that I don't believe it'll take two messiahs. I don't believe there's any Palestinian leadership and very few Palestinians who want to live side by side with the Jewish state of Israel as Canada lives with America. But if there were, philosophically, I'm willing to take what has been the traditional Zionist view since the 1930s to today, and I'll live with a two-state solution, but only under those conditions. My question for you is, do you see it differently? Or would you agree with me that although it's a messianic vision, if there were a Messiah who would bring that reality to bear, Ken Levin would be willing to see a two-state solution implemented from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea?
Not only would I be willing to do that, but I'm insignificant in the kind of broader context. The vast majority of Israelis would.
Absolutely.
There was an interesting poll, well, two polls conducted almost the same time in the mid-1980s. I forget which year exactly, and was subsequently presented by people. Look at how conflicted the Israelis are. They give one answer to one poll and another to the other. Because one poll said that the vast majority of Israelis thought it was too dangerous to give up. We cannot create another state in this land. And the other said, largely by a significant majority, yes, we would. Well, how could you have these contradictory polls? Because if you look at the questions, one poll was presented as, given the realities, are you prepared to? And the other poll, which was a Haaretz poll, I believe, said it in ideal terms, utopian terms. If there were absolute assurance the other side wanted peace, would you be willing to? So it's exactly the way you framed it.
And the answer always has been for the Israeli, of
yes,
course.
Of course.
Of course. Okay. So I want our audience to understand, and very rarely, the two-state solution discussion is never framed in those terms.
Right.
The question is not, are you for a two-state solution? The question is, are you for a two-state solution without a Canada-U.S. model? Right. And it seems to me that any American Jew who cares about Israel is going to understand that there is no Canada-America model at the moment, and therefore to be for a two-state solution which will put Israel into harm's way to one degree or another. Now, there are generals in Israel that disagree about how much, but it's harm to one degree or another. It's an American Jew should not be arguing for a two-state solution as if it doesn't matter whether there's peace between Israel and the Palestinian people. Now, I did this digression in the midst of your saying, in the Oslo period, you begin to write about an Israeli, larger Jewish mentality,
yes,
which hopes so profoundly that it's willing to suspend rational judgment. Isn't that the point?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm asking you now, go back for me to when you decide to write this book. And I asked you a moment ago, and I don't want to lose the train, who are you politically? The reason is I wanted to know whether people would say, oh, you know why Ken Levin wrote this book? Because he's a passionate, right-wing, settlement-loving Jew who wants Judea Samaria for biblical reasons. And so you were against Oslo, Ken, from the beginning. And this book is only your explication of how you are against it. And I wanted the audience to understand that's not where you were coming from.
That's certainly not where I'm coming from.
If you could have had an ideal world, you would have been happy to give up West Bank.
Absolutely.
Okay. But you saw something else happening.
Yes.
And I want you to talk about that a little bit more. Not only, don't start with America, start with Israel.
Okay. Well, if you go back, I mentioned something before, I referred before to 77. And if you look before 77, there were some Israelis, a very small minority, who always said that Israel was in the wrong, maybe Israel shouldn't have been created, all this, and typically people on the left. But they got very little traction. The vast majority of Israelis, including people on the left, identified with Israeli policy, and that policy was being informed by leftists, by labor. Labor controlled Israel all during the years of the Yishuv and in the 30 years of the first 30 years of the state. What happened with the Begin election, and it wasn't a rational change, because if you look at actual policies, they don't support the change, and now we can go into details of that. But what happened after 77, when Begin was elected, it was, for the very reasons I mentioned, a tidal wave change, amazing change in the context of Israel. And the voter the voting blocks for Begin were typically the more religious among the Ashkenazi, and the more traditional Sephardi, who were generally more traditional. And many people on the left, including the elites on the left, did not see this just as an election defeat. They saw it as the loss of the state to them. These alien groups had taken over the state. Now, if I can digress somewhat into diaspora history. In diaspora, you have a long history of Jews embracing the indictments of their attackers, of the anti-Semites.
Is that true?
Absolutely true.
Can you give us an example or two?
I can give you many, but I could.
Embracing what the indictors
indictment,
say.
Right.
Give me an example.
For example, one famous writer, Zionist, in 1920, a friend of Herzl, said that the greatest success of the anti-Semites is that they've come to see themselves through anti-Semitic eyes. The Jews have come to see themselves through anti-Semitic eyes. I'll give you in Eastern Europe, where in some ways was, in some respects, among the intelligentsia, among the elites, and even among the common people, you see less of it than you saw in the West. But because there was much, for historical reasons we can go into or not, there was much more of a national identity as well as a religious identity in the East. But if you talk about the terrible conditions that Jews experienced under the Tsarist regimes, and remember, Russia had virtually no Jewish population until the divisions of Poland in the late 18th century, and then they inherited these Jewish populations, and then the policy was very hostile. They essentially introduced policies to destroy them economically, the Jews in the area, to force them either to convert or to leave. One Russian minister in the 1880s said, well, our goal is to force a third of the Jews to leave, a third to die, and a third to convert. And by that point, by the 80s, the main alternative with the assassination of the liberal czar, the more liberal czar, Alexander II, the main alternative to the Tsarist regime were socialist groups that were forming in Russia, and Jews were having influences somewhat, although unlike in the West, embracing socialism did not mean giving up Judaism. But it particularly did not mean giving up Jewish nationalism. And that took two major forms in the subsequent decades. But whichever form it took, it embraced the anti-Semitic indictments, which were typically focused, or today they chose to see it as typically focused, on religious Jews and on the Jewish bourgeoisie. And so it had an impact in the Bund, which talked about Jews staying in Europe, but with a sort of national element to it. And it had impact on early Zionists. And whereas Herzl comprehended Zionism as being for all Jews, for the secular, for the religious, for Eastern Jews, for Western Jews, for Ashkenazi, for Sephardim, for the socialist Jews and bourgeois Jews, the Zionist parties that arose in the East typically took the view, well, anti-Semitism feeds on Jewish religiosity and Jewish bourgeois ways. And that if we're going to create a Zionist state, a Jewish state, simply creating a Jewish state, unlike what Herzl thought would not end anti-Semitism, it had to be a Jewish state created on socialist and secular principles.
anti-bourgeois and anti-religion.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, and is that true for American Jews as well? Is there, because when you say Jews sort of identify with and incorporate the anti-Semitic canard, I'm thinking to myself, what does that mean in terms of the American Jewish experience?
Well, the American Jewish experience is very interesting. There are people who studied this a lot more than I have, Rabbi Herzberg, for example, and his take on it, and I think it's a very interesting take, that if you look at inner city, big city Jews in the post the large immigrations, of course the large immigrations ended when the U.S. imposed limitations, but so in New York particularly, obviously, in Philadelphia, that their affiliations with temples was loose, and all, but they were religious. They had some, and they identified as Jews. And to some degree, the religious identity was ebbing over the decades. But with the post-World War II move to the suburbs, they founded synagogues in the suburbs. And Herzberg suggests that this was not a return to religion or even an embrace of religion. He said that this was another way of ingratiation, because it was the Gentile population in the suburbs were building churches and establishing churches, and the Jews largely felt that this was to have a religion, to embrace a religion, to build houses of worship, made them more acceptable than if they weren't. And it's an interesting perspective.
Yes, his argument was that they were not doing it, ironically, for intrinsically Jewish reasons.
Right.
They were doing it as a form of assimilation.
Exactly right.
I want to read a passage from this monograph you recently did for the Begin Sadat organization, okay, at Bar-Ilan, was it?
Yes.
You wrote this: many American Jews have a predilection to appease anti-Jewish opinion by seeking to accommodate anti-Jewish indictments, has always had some negative impact on support for Israel among American Jews. In recent decades, as groups within the wider society with whom many American Jews identify have become increasingly critical of and even hostile towards Israel, major segments of the Jewish community have chosen cultivation of their links with these groups over the defense of the well-being of the Jewish state. That's a very powerful and well-written paragraph in which you're saying the Jews are identifying with those who are critical of Israel in an effort to ingratiate, you use the word appease, and to be in some way accepted by the anti-Semite. I want to make sure our audience understands what you're saying. Ken, can you give us any examples of this phenomenon in today's American Jewish community?
I think you can and let me preface it if I can. The question of, we read about Jews falling away from support of Israel.
Yes.
Now, I think in some statements of that, I think, are overstated. And if you look at some of the polls that suggest that there's, I believe, skewed polls. I think there's a lot of support for Israel within the Jewish community today, as there always has been. But there is some falling away. And a question is, if I'm making the argument that under duress, Jews try to accommodate the wider society, one could pose the question of why in the United States, where Israel is still very popular, why in the United States would there be any falling away when 65%, whatever the particular percentage that you see in these Gallup polls and other polls of people, Americans broadly supporting Israel?
Why is there similar support in the American Jewish community?
Why would you have under those conditions any falling away?
Yes.
And I think the answer is that much of that 65% aren't the Americans that the Jews associate with, identify with.
Whom do American Jews identify with?
They identify with the cultural elites, they identify with media elites, they identify with academic elites. And you asked me to give examples. Look on the campuses. How many Jews on campuses have either embraced the anti-Israel phenomenon
The SJP phenomenon.
on campus,
Absolutely.
or yes,
many.
and including the faculty, and often lead these efforts, or at least are silent, are afraid to speak up, and won't speak up.
And the reason why?
Because they want to be loved, they want to be accepted. If you look at Jews embracing anti-Jewish canards throughout history, they never say, or virtually never say, I'm doing this to ingratiate myself with the anti-Semites.
It doesn't occur to them.
It doesn't. They say they're doing it for some higher moral reason.
Correct. Out of principle.
Out of principle.
And very often they'll say, out of Jewish values.
Exactly. Exactly, which is not nonsense, you know. And we saw that. I wrote in my book at one point that people would say this about those who embrace Arafat as a peace partner, and this is moral, that somehow high Jewish values to look for peace under any conditions. I said, well, but essentially you're saying that you have to accept his indictments to do that. And my understanding of Jewish demand for adherence to moral principle was that you do those, adhere to moral principles as defined within Judaism, as laid down by the Lord, by God, not adhering to principles laid down by Yasser Arafat.
There has been a rise in anti-Semitism throughout Western Europe
Yes.
and Eastern Europe. There are many American Jews now who worry about anti-Semitism in America. It seems to me that the real threat of anti-Semitism here, and I don't see it as a threat anything like what's happening in Western Europe, but the threat, it seems to me, happens when on college campuses you have what you call the elite, but in the halls of academia, whether it's professors or the most bellicose students, are virulently anti-Israel. Anti-Israel is the Satan. That's the way it's portrayed. And SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, are perceived as those who are fighting for some kind of underdog and justice. And now we see that creeping into, on the edges of, mainstream democratic politics.
Yes.
And we're seeing freshman congresswomen, as we tape, saying they're all for BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel, which is a code for saying they shouldn't be in Israel.
Right.
And then, Ken, as you and I are taping, it wasn't too very long ago as we're sitting here, the New York Times has not one but two cartoons, one of which was heinous
Yes.
in its anti-Semitic overtones, as if to say Israel is leading the American government, which is blind, and it's Trump who's a fool.
Right.
Why has there not been, within the American Jewish democratic organizations, why has there been no pushback? Why has there been no pushback from the adults in the Democratic Party saying to a Talib or to an Omar, that is absolutely unacceptable, and if you want to be part of any House committee, that can't be your orientation. And I put this to you as a large question, but I put it to you, is this in any way, in some way, a sister of the Oslo Syndrome that you write about in your book?
I believe so, yes. And I think it's shameful that Jewish leaders of traditional Jewish organizations, defense organizations, have failed to speak up.
Haven't they?
They have failed to speak up. And that given a choice between adherence to a party and adherence to basic moral values and the Jewish identity, but moral values beyond that. I mean, I think it's shameful for non-Jews not to speak up in this context. They've chosen not to. Now,
why has Democratic leadership not said anything? By the way, I've been given three answers, and I want you to tell me which one you like most. Okay. One is there's a certain malevolence. They're anti-Semitic. Two, they don't know any better. They don't know the facts. So when a Talib says that she's calmed by the Holocaust when she thinks of the fact that Palestinians saved Jews, even though it cost them their lives and their national identity. But she takes some pride, as if, in the fact that the Palestinians helped save the Jews in the Holocaust. It is rewriting history. It's putting history 180. That's not what the Grand Mufti was doing. That's not what the Arab community for the world was Palestinian, but the Arab community was not helping Jews get to Palestine and survive the Holocaust. They were planning on a final solution themselves.
Right.
Now, does Pelosi not say that because she doesn't know the facts and she doesn't realize what she should be saying? Or is she doing it either because she's glad it's being said on some subconscious level? Or is it because she's simply afraid politically? Is it malevolence, ignorance, or political self-interest?
Well, I can't read Pelosi's mind.
But you have an
those
instinct. What's your
Steny
instinct?
Hoyer, I think it's definitely the third.
Self-interest.
Political, yes.
Okay.
Does
she know better?
I think they both know better.
She knows the history.
Yeah, Steny Hoyer maybe more so than Pelosi, but they both know the history. Absolutely.
Doesn't it upset you?
Oh, yes.
That it upsets me the Jewish members of Congress. Where's Elliot Engel?
Right.
You know, and where's Blumenthal? And where's Cardin? And where's Schumer? And then where are all of the non-Jewish members of both the House and Senate who aren't saying this is outrageous? And why is it, Ken, that Jewish liberals still idolize the New York Times when the Times can have the kind of cartoon that comes right out of Nazi Germany?
Well, you could pose that question for the last 50, 60, 70 years about the Times. I mean, it's gotten worse in some respects. It's amazing because they, even in this editorial, when they were finally forced, after they first said, oh, we made a mistake, and then the second thing was an apology, and the third is the editorial statement, the editor's statement, when they were finally forced to make that statement and talked about their regrets over failing to cover the Holocaust. But they've continued ever since. Where are their regrets over? Why then, if they were genuine regrets over failing to cover the Holocaust, have they consistently failed to cover the incitement to genocide against Jews by Palestinians in their mosques, in their schools, in their media, by the broader Arab world, in their mosques and schools and media, and more recently, and more recent years, even more broadly in the Muslim world? The Times has always failed. And yet Jews embrace them. Part of the answer, going back to the book, is you said what? One of the accommodations that Jews have made in trying to protect themselves as they understood it, in embracing the indictments of their attackers, a persistent indictment going back to the first sparks of discussion of giving civil rights to Jews, civic rights to Jews in the late 18th, early 19th century, was that Jews are too parochial. They're only interested in their own community, they don't want to do it. And one reaction to that was for Jewish groups to become ostentatiously unparochial, if you want to say that, to demonstrate as explicitly as they can that their interests are much wider, even if in doing so they went against Jewish interests. Now, to some degree, Jews brought that with them to the United States. And if we look at, for example, when Jews overwhelmingly became supportive of the Democratic Party, and that was in the Franklin Roosevelt era. Now, there were good reasons for that, too. In the 30s, when Roosevelt was first elected, it was difficult for Jews to get employed, to get into good schools, to get into good professions. And I think it was Hertzberg who said then the only profession the Jews could be sure of getting. Maybe it wasn't Herzberg. It was becoming a rabbi. And with the New Deal, or creation of jobs, was open to Jews. There were other jobs that were open to Jews. So there were good reasons to some degree, for the embrace of Roosevelt at that time. But an attraction for Jews was we can immerse ourselves in this broad, what they saw as Roosevelt's broad alliance of the disadvantaged. And we won't stand out quad Jews, and they can't say that we're just pursuing our own parochial interests. We're joining in others of the disadvantaged, and even more disadvantaged than we perhaps to some degree, and immersing ourselves in that, and that would win us acceptance. And there's been a logic to that ever since. And even there's a comprehension among Jews in this country. I think if you looked at it now, a couple of Harvard sociologists looked at it in the 90s, where polls of Jews revealed that they were convinced that conservatives were more anti-Jewish than liberals, even though nothing in Jewish history in America supports that. Not that there didn't exist anti-Semitism, but it existed at least as much among, quote, liberals as among conservatives. Yeah, that's the conviction. And part of immersing oneself in Democratic politics was, for a long time, this was a protection of Jews. But in a sense, the defense became the raison d'etre. You know, it was no longer we're Democrats to defend ourselves. It became this is who we are, period, to a large degree. And I think there's an attempt to downplay, even if not fully consciously, downplay the horrendous nature of the attacks you're seeing now, to minimize it. Well, it's within the Democratic Party, and it really won't get that much traction in this and that. And it's totally delusional.
It's delusional.
It's delusional.
What would you like to see from American Jewish leadership in response to what's happening now?
To stand up and call it for what it is. Then to say, part of the, if we say, and I did say, you know, he gave me the three choices, and I said it's political calculation. I don't believe that either Steny Hoyer or the Speaker or other leaders within, main leaders within the Democratic Party, within themselves, harbor anti-Jewish feeling. I do not believe that.
It's not malevolence.
It's not malevolence at all. And I don't believe they're that ignorant of the history.
You don't think so?
I don't think so. I think that they may not be that. They know enough of the history.
You think they know that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was meeting with Hitler during World War II?
They know. If they don't know that, they certainly know that that the Arabs and the British together made sure that no Jews were allowed out of Europe to survive.
You think someone like Nancy Pelosi knows that the Arabs worked to keep Jews out of Palestine?
I think so.
During the Holocaust.
I think so.
And so when Tlaib says the opposite, Nancy knows she's wrong.
I believe so.
So it's not malevolence.
I don't know.
Okay, I know, we're guessing.
Yeah.
But from your perspective, it's not malevolence, it's not ignorance, it's political self-interest.
It's political self-interest. But then that just points all the more to the bankruptcy of the Jewish leadership in not creating a counterweight. Where are they pulling them, saying to these leaders, no, we'll make sure it's in your self-interest not to do this. Because we're going to counter it, we're going to raise hell about it.
But wait, that's my question for you. Is raising hell, in your view, a legitimate strategy right now? Because there are some Jewish leaders who are saying, raising hell will do no good. But what this reminds me, and you're right about this, it reminds me of Stephen Wise during World War II, when FDR famously says to him, don't make World War II a Jewish war. And so Stephen Wise goes along with it and basically tries to keep the Holocaust element of World War II out of the New York Times and out of the news, because America should be seen not as trying to do this to save Jews, but to save the world and to defeat fascism. In some way, there are American Jews now who say, if you raise hell, all you'll do is exacerbate the problem and make things worse. The leadership will get angry at you. You'll be in some way embarrassing them. And also, you will generate more anti-Semitism. Ken Levin, what is your answer to anybody who makes that argument?
Well, when I mean raising hell, I mean raising hell on factual basis, giving you the material basis for why you're raising hell. But I think the strategy, for the most part, the strategy of the Schweigende Juden, the quiet Jew who tries to get along by being quiet, has typically not worked out that well for Jews.
It has never never. I want to summarize this again. You initially wrote the Oslo Syndrome because you were worried that within the Jewish world, both in Israel and in America, there were those who so much wanted there to be peace, so much wanted there to be on the other side a benevolent leader who would say, I'm embracing Jews and I'm embracing the state of Israel and the enmity is over and the war is over. And out of this desire, it had more to do with hope than reality. And because there was within the elite halls of America, both in academia and in media, some in entertainment, that to be part of that, you had to champion the cause of the Palestinian and in some way say, yes, now Israel and the Palestinians can make peace, that the Jew deluded himself during the Oslo peace process. And I'm now asking you, and you wrote something similar now in this latest monograph. The same process that was at work during Oslo, and Oslo proved to be worse than a failure. It's worse than a failure.
Yes.
Okay. And thousands of Jews lost their lives, and it created political havoc in Israel that we have yet not recovered from. That the same thing that was happening then in Oslo, that the Oslo Syndrome, which is your way of saying the Stockholm Syndrome applied to Jews, is at work even today.
Yes.
And lastly, for you, the best evidence of it, if you had to say, and let me show you, we've talked about the 3 congresswomen, we've talked about how at the moment there is still this idealization of the Palestinians. In your mind, what is the most egregious or what keeps you up at night when this issue keeps you up at night and you wish American Jews understood better?
The campuses. And the drift further down into the educational system, into the high schools and junior high schools, of the poison of the campuses. Mm-hmm. The anti-Israel and anti-Semitic themes that are so widespread on the campuses and are getting wider and wider play. And the failure of Jewish alumni, the failure of Jewish professors, the failure of Jewish leaders to begin to address this.
Have you abandoned the liberalism of Kennedy and Jackson and Humphrey?
No.
You're still that.
Absolutely.
Yes. In some way, when people define another as liberal, it's as if it is some kind of pejorative. The problem is I am proud to be a liberal. I believe what people mean by liberal has changed.
Can I mention 2 things?
Please.
What could be more representative of liberalism, traditional liberalism, than freedom of speech and than Martin Luther King's insistence that we judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin? And who now is acting against those 2 principles, and where is it being most diminished, most attacked, most undercut? On the campuses by the left, and mainly, and to some degree, even within the Democratic Party.
On the fringes of the far left, the
Yes.
Democratic Party, yes. When you hear somebody say to you, when it comes to voting for the President of the United States, my number 1 issue is the state of Israel, the well-being of the state of Israel. That's my number one issue when I go to the polls as an American citizen in an American presidential election. What's your reaction? Is there anything wrong with an American Jew saying, my number one issue is Israel?
I can only speak for myself. My fervent belief is that America's national interests and Israel's core interests coincide. And support for Israel, and this is something that was said way before Israel emerged as a nation, emerged as a liberal democracy. This was said by Judge Brandeis back in 1915, that the pursuit of small nations living on their empires, he thought their liberation would serve the world and serve American interests. And he said the same would happen with the emergence of the Jewish state. And I think he was absolutely right. So certainly people's position on Israel weighs significantly with me. People's position on American defense policies weighs very heavily with me. And I think the defense of America and the defense of Israel coincide to a large degree.
Mm-hmm. You have done wonderful work. What a contribution you've made. Not everybody in life gets to make the kind of contribution you've made. Kol hakavod to you and to your wife. You have done fabulous work for the Jewish people. And I believe you've done fabulous work for humanity as a whole. So, kol tuv v'hatzlacha, you should only go from strength to strength. You have to keep writing, you have to keep talking, and you have to come back and spend more time with me here on JBS. Is that okay?
And I very much appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you very, very much. Ken Levin, author of The Oslo Syndrome, Delusions of a People Under Siege, published by Smith & Krauss, as well as this monograph he's written entitled American Jews and Their Israel Problem. And there's so much to discuss. And so it's only the first time he'll be here on JBS. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to any of the ideas expressed on this edition of L'Chaim. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook page, or tweet me. I love hearing from you. And if you want to be in touch with Ken Levin, email me, and I will pass your emails on to him. Also, remember, you can now listen to L'Chaim on podcast. Go to iTunes or Google Play, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and you can take L'Chaim with you everywhere you go. And so until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'Chaim, my friends, to life.
L'Chaim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.